Imagine being 12 years old and being forced to fight wild animals in the arena for the entertainment of screaming crowds, or being locked in underground chambers where your only job is to pleasure wealthy Romans who see you as nothing more than a disposable toy to be used and discarded when you're no longer appealing. Picture teenagers being systematically tortured, not as punishment for crimes, but as training to make them more obedient and profitable for their masters, while others are deliberately starved and abused to maintain the perfect combination of beauty and desperation that Roman buyers found most attractive. This isn't fiction from a horror movie. This is the documented reality of what happened to hundreds of thousands of young slaves in ancient Rome, where being young and attractive was literally a death sentence wrapped in gold chains and silk clothing. What you're about to discover about the systematic horror inflicted on teenage slaves will shatter every sanitized image you've ever had about Roman civilization and reveal a level of cruelty that modern minds can barely comprehend. Hit that subscribe button immediately, because the documented evidence of what Romans did to teenage slaves is so disturbing that most history books refuse to include these details. The specialized markets for teenage slaves in ancient Rome operated with a level of sophisticated cruelty that specifically targeted adolescents between the ages of 12 and 18, as Roman buyers had developed preferences for young slaves who combined physical attractiveness with psychological vulnerability that could be exploited for various forms of entertainment, labor, and sexual gratification. These markets weren't just commercial centers. They were systematic processing facilities designed to transform terrified teenagers into profitable commodities that would appeal to the most depraved tastes of Roman high society. The evaluation procedures used to assess teenage slaves involved degrading physical examinations that were specifically designed to determine their potential value for different types of exploitation, with dealers paying particular attention to signs of physical development, emotional stability, and psychological resistance that would affect their marketability. Teenage girls were evaluated for their potential in sexual slavery, domestic service, and entertainment roles, while teenage boys faced assessment for gladiatorial training, specialized labor, and the growing market for male sexual slaves that catered to wealthy Roman men's particular preferences. The psychological conditioning that teenage slaves underwent before being sold was designed to break their spirits on maintaining their physical attractiveness, creating a combination of beauty and desperation that Roman buyers found particularly appealing. This conditioning involved systematic sleep deprivation, controlled starvation, and emotional manipulation that would leave teenagers physically stunning but psychologically shattered, making them more compliant and valuable to potential buyers who wanted attractive slaves who wouldn't resist their demands. The pricing structures used in teenage slave markets reveal how Roman society had developed sophisticated economic systems for commodifying adolescent suffering, with different age groups, physical characteristics, and skill sets commanding specific price ranges that reflected their expected profitability for various forms of exploitation. 14-year-old girls with particular physical features could command prices equivalent to modern six-figure sums, while teenage boys with athletic builds were valued based on their potential for gladiatorial combat or specialized entertainment. The marketing strategies employed by slave dealers specifically targeted the teenage slave market through elaborate presentation techniques that emphasized youth, beauty, and vulnerability while downplaying the humanity and suffering of the adolescents being sold. Dealers would stage theatrical presentations where teenage slaves were displayed in costumes and scenarios designed to showcase their potential for various roles, creating shopping experiences that treated the purchase of human teenagers as entertainment. For wealthy buyers, the legal protections that existed for teenage slave buyers were extensive and detailed, ensuring that purchasers would receive full value for their investment, while providing no protections whatsoever for the teenagers being bought and sold. Roman law included warranty provisions that allowed buyers to return teenage slaves who didn't meet their expectations, exchange policies for slaves who became ill or injured, and legal remedies for buyers who felt they had been deceived about. At teenagers' age, health, or potential capabilities. The geographic scope of teenage slave trading reveals how Rome had created international networks, specifically focused on acquiring adolescents from conquered territories with military campaigns, often planned partly around the potential for capturing attractive teenagers who could be sold in Roman markets. Certain regions became known for producing teenagers with specific physical characteristics that appealed to Roman buyers, leading to systematic kidnapping and trafficking operations that operated with governmental approval and military support. Social normalization of teenage slave trading in Roman culture is demonstrated by the casual references to these practices in contemporary literature, art, and legal documents that treat the buying and selling of adolescents as normal commercial activity rather than as the systematic trafficking and exploitation of children that it actually represented. Wealthy Roman families would attend teenage slave auctions as social events, bringing their own children to learn how to evaluate and purchase human property, creating cultural transmission of these practices across generations. The gladiatorial training programs specifically designed for teenage slaves represent some of the most systematic child abuse in human history, as Roman entrepreneurs discovered that adolescents between 13 and 17 could be molded into spectacular fighters who would provide more entertaining deaths than adult gladiators while commanding higher prices from audiences who enjoyed watching young people kill each other for sport. These schools weren't just training facilities. They were death factories that transformed terrified teenagers into skilled killers while ensuring they would provide maximum entertainment value during their inevitable deaths in the arena. The selection criteria used to identify promising teenage gladiators involved evaluating adolescents for physical characteristics and psychological traits that would make them effective fighters while ensuring they possessed the youth and beauty that Roman audiences found most entertaining in combat scenarios. Trainers looked for specific combinations of athletic ability, pain tolerance, and emotional resilience that could be developed through intensive conditioning, while also prioritizing physical attractiveness that would make their eventual deaths more dramatic and emotionally impactful for spectators. The training regimens implemented in teenage gladiator schools subjected adolescent recruits to physical conditioning that would be considered torture by any modern standard, involving systematic programs designed to build muscle mass and combat skills while breaking down psychological resistance to violence and death. Teenage gladiators were forced to exercise for up to 12 hours daily while receiving minimal nutrition, creating bodies that were lean, fast, and desperate enough to fight with the ferocity that audiences demanded from adolescent combatants. The weapon specialization programs developed for teenage gladiators created different categories of young fighters, each trained in specific combat styles that would provide variety and entertainment value for arena audiences who had developed sophisticated preferences for different types of teenage combat. Some adolescents were trained as lightly armored fighters who relied on speed and agility, while others were conditioned for heavily armored combat that typically resulted in severe injuries or death for at least one participant, with the training process beginning as early as age 12. The psychological manipulation techniques used in teenage gladiator schools were designed to create artificial loyalty and competitive drives that would prevent escape attempts while encouraging fierce competition between adolescent trainees who were being prepared to kill each other for entertainment. Trainers would adopt paternal roles toward their teenage students while simultaneously preparing them for death, creating complex emotional relationships that made resistance more difficult while ensuring that young gladiators would fight with maximum intensity. The medical care provided to teenage gladiators reveals how these schools operated as commercial enterprises, focused on maximizing profit from their adolescent investments, while accepting that most trainees would die in combat before reaching adulthood. Schools employed physicians who specialized in treating combat injuries and maintaining young fighters in peak condition. But this medical attention was purely economic rather than humanitarian, designed to preserve the investment value of teenage gladiators rather than to protect their health or well-being. The graduation ceremonies that marked teenage gladiators' transition from training to arena combat were designed to create psychological commitment to their deadly roles, while providing final opportunities for trainers to evaluate their human investments. These events combined religious rituals, oath-taking ceremonies, and preliminary combat trials that served as both celebration and final examination, with successful graduates understanding that they had achieved specialized status within the slave system while also accepting that their life expectancy was now measured in months rather than years. The audience preferences that drove the teenage gladiator market reveal how Roman society had developed specific entertainment demands for watching adolescents fight and die, with spectators showing particular enthusiasm for combat scenarios that emphasized the youth and beauty of the fighters while maximizing the emotional impact of their inevitable deaths. These preferences created market incentives that encouraged the systematic abuse and exploitation of teenagers while treating their suffering as a source of entertainment rather than as a human tragedy. Content. Warning. This chapter addresses historical facts about teenage sexual exploitation in ancient Rome. The content is educational and historically accurate, but deals with extremely disturbing subject matter. The systematic sexual exploitation of teenage slaves in ancient Rome operated through sophisticated networks that specifically targeted adolescents for their youth and vulnerability, creating commercial systems that treated the sexual abuse of teenagers as a legitimate business opportunity rather than as the horrific crime that it represented. Roman law not only permitted but actively facilitated the sexual exploitation of teenage slaves, while providing extensive legal protections for the adults who purchased and abused them, creating an institutional framework that normalized the systematic rape and abuse of adolescent victims. The specialized brothels that catered exclusively to clients seeking teenage victims operated with governmental approval and legal protection, employing adolescent slaves who had been specifically purchased for sexual exploitation and trained to satisfy the particular demands of Roman clients who preferred young victims. These establishments weren't hidden or illegal operations. They were legitimate businesses that advertised their services openly and paid taxes too. Roman authorities, while systematically abusing teenagers who had no legal recourse or protection from their exploitation. The training programs that prepared teenage slaves for sexual exploitation involved systematic psychological conditioning designed to break their resistance while maintaining their physical attractiveness and apparent willingness to participate in their own abuse. This conditioning included controlled starvation, sleep deprivation, and emotional manipulation that would create teenagers who appeared eager to please their abusers while actually being too psychologically damaged to resist or escape from their exploitation. The legal framework surrounding teenage sexual slavery provided extensive protections for buyers and users while ensuring that adolescent victims had no rights or means of seeking justice for their abuse. Roman law treated teenage slaves as property that could be used for any purpose their owners desired, including sexual abuse, while creating legal penalties for anyone who interfered with an owner's use of his human property. The law provided detailed regulations about the buying, selling, and use of teenage sexual slaves while offering no protections for the chia, adolescent victims. The medical infrastructure that supported teenage sexual exploitation included physicians who specialized in treating injuries caused by abuse while helping owners maintain their victims' health and appearance for continued exploitation. These medical professionals developed expertise in treating trauma in adolescent victims while simultaneously participating in the system that created their injuries, providing medical care that was designed to preserve the commercial value of teenage sex slaves rather than to protect their health or well-being. The international trafficking networks that supplied teenage victims for Roman sexual exploitation operated on a continental scale, with established trade routes that moved adolescents specifically selected for sexual abuse from conquered territories throughout the empire to Roman markets, where they would be sold to brothels and private buyers. Military campaigns often included specific objectives for capturing teenagers who could be sold into sexual slavery, while diplomatic relationships sometimes involved the exchange of adolescent victims as gifts between political leaders. The cultural normalization of teenage sexual abuse among Roman elites demonstrates how systematic exploitation had become so embedded in upper-class lifestyle that wealthy Romans openly discussed their abuse of adolescent slaves as normal social behavior. Literary works and historical accounts from the period show that Roman society had developed elaborate cultural justifications for teenage sexual abuse, presenting it as natural expression of power relationships rather than criminal victimization of vulnerable adolescents. The psychological impact of systematic sexual abuse on teenage slaves created severe trauma that affected not only immediate victims, but entire generations of slave families who understood that their children faced almost certain sexual exploitation upon reaching adolescence. The intergenerational trauma created by systematic teenage sexual abuse affected slave communities throughout the Roman Empire, creating cycles of psychological damage that persisted long after individual victims had died or been discarded by their abusers. The mining operations that employed teenage slaves represent some of the most horrific working conditions in human history, as Roman engineers discovered that adolescents possessed the perfect combination of small body size, developing strength, and psychological resilience that made them ideal for the most dangerous and profitable forms of underground extraction work. These teenagers weren't just workers. They were expendable tools designed to access the narrowest mine shafts and most dangerous excavation sites, while generating maximum profit for their owners, who viewed their inevitable deaths as acceptable. Business expenses. The selection process for teenage miners involved evaluating adolescent slaves for specific physical characteristics that would make them effective in underground work, including small stature that would allow access to narrow passages, developing muscle mass that could handle heavy labor, and psychological traits that suggested they could survive the extreme isolation and danger of underground mining without suffering complete mental breakdown. The most valuable teenage miners were those who could work in complete darkness while maintaining productivity levels that justified their purchase and maintenance costs. The working conditions in Roman mines were deliberately designed to extract maximum labor from teenage workers while minimizing the costs associated with their care and survival, creating underground environments that were so dangerous and unhealthy that most teenage miners died within 6 months of beginning their underground labor. These adolescents worked 12 to 16 hours daily in complete darkness, breathing toxic fumes and stone dust that would destroy their lungs within weeks, while facing constant danger from cave-ins, flooding, and gas explosions that killed more teenagers than any other occupational hazard. The psychological impact of underground mining on teenage slaves was devastating and permanent, as adolescents who spent months working in complete darkness often developed severe mental health problems, including hallucinations, extreme anxiety, and complete emotional withdrawal from reality. The isolation and sensory deprivation experienced by teenage miners created psychological conditions that were equivalent to modern torture techniques, while the constant fear of death from mining accidents added additional layers of trauma that destroyed their capacity for normal emotional development. The nutrition and medical care provided to teenage miners was deliberately minimal, as mine owners understood that providing adequate food and health care would reduce their profit margins, while offering no guarantee that well-fed teenagers would survive the dangerous mining conditions any longer than malnourished ones. Teenage miners received barely enough food to maintain their working capacity while being denied any medical treatment for the respiratory diseases, injuries, and psychological problems that were inevitable consequences of underground labor. The disposal methods used for teenage miners who died or became too sick to work reveal the complete dehumanization that characterized Roman mining operations, as dead or disabled adolescents were typically thrown into abandoned mine shafts or left in underground chambers where their bodies would decompose without requiring any burial expenses or administrative processing. These disposal practices were so systematic that archaeological excavations of Roman mining sites have uncovered mass graves containing hundreds of teenage remains that show clear evidence of mining-related deaths. The economic calculations that drove teenage mining operations demonstrate how Roman society had developed sophisticated cost-benefit analyses that treated adolescent lives as purely financial considerations, with mine owners maintaining detailed records of teenage worker productivity, death rates, and replacement costs that reveal how systematically they approached the exploitation and disposal of adolescent human beings. These economic records show that teenage miners were expected to generate profits equivalent to several times their purchase price before their inevitable deaths. The geographic scope of teenage mining operations extended throughout the Roman Empire, with specialized mining camps that focused exclusively on employing adolescent workers in the most dangerous extraction work, while adult slaves were reserved for less hazardous but less profitable mining activities. The systematic use of teenage miners in the most dangerous underground work created an empire-wide industry that consumed thousands of adolescent lives annually while generating enormous profits for Roman mining companies and their governmental partners. The teenage slaves, who served wealthy Roman families as luxury household servants, faced a unique form of systematic abuse that combined physical exploitation with psychological manipulation, creating conditions where adolescents were trapped in environments that appeared privileged and comfortable while actually being subjected to constant surveillance, emotional manipulation, and sexual abuse that was hidden behind the facade of domestic service. These teenagers weren't just servants. They were living trophies designed to display their owners' wealth and power, while being systematically destroyed through subtle but devastating forms of long-term abuse. The selection criteria for luxury. Teenage servants involved evaluating adolescent slaves for combinations of physical beauty, intelligence, and psychological traits that would make them effective at maintaining their owners' households while providing entertainment and personal services that went far beyond normal domestic work. These teenagers were expected to be constantly available for any demand their owners might make, while maintaining perfect appearances and cheerful dispositions, regardless of the abuse they experienced behind closed doors. The training programs that prepared teenagers for luxury domestic service involved comprehensive conditioning designed to eliminate their individual personalities, while creating artificial personas that would be more appealing to their wealthy owners. This training included instruction in music, poetry, and sophisticated social skills, but also systematic psychological manipulation that would make teenagers grateful for their exploitation while destroying their capacity to recognize or resist abuse. The goal was to create adolescents who would enthusiastically participate in their own oppression while believing they were fortunate to serve in wealthy households. The daily routines imposed on teenage luxury servants required them to be available 24 hours a day for any service their owners demanded, while maintaining perfect grooming and emotional presentation, regardless of their physical or psychological condition. These adolescents were expected to perform complex household management tasks, provide entertainment for guests, and satisfy their owners' personal needs while never showing signs of fatigue, illness, or emotional distress that might diminish their value as luxury possessions. The psychological manipulation techniques used to control teenage luxury servants were sophisticated and devastating, involving systematic programs designed to create emotional dependence on their abusers while eliminating their capacity for independent thought or resistance. Wealthy Roman families would alternate between lavish gifts and severe punishments, creating trauma bonds that made teenage servants psychologically unable to recognize their abuse or seek escape from their exploitation. The sexual abuse that teenage luxury servants experienced was often disguised as education, affection, or privilege, making it difficult for adolescent victims to understand that they were being systematically exploited rather than receiving special attention from their owners. This hidden sexual abuse was particularly damaging because it was accompanied by gifts, praise, and apparent affection that confused teenage victims about the nature of their exploitation while making them feel complicit in their own abuse. Social isolation imposed on teenage luxury servants prevented them from forming relationships with other slaves or developing support networks that might help them recognize their abuse or plan escapes from their exploitation. These adolescents were deliberately separated from other household slaves and prevented from communicating with anyone outside their owner's immediate family, creating complete social isolation that made psychological manipulation more effective, while eliminating potential sources of assistance or emotional support. Not the disposal methods used when teenage luxury servants became too old or damaged to maintain their appeal reveals how these adolescents were ultimately treated as disposable commodities despite the significant investments their owners had made in their training and conditioning. Teenage servants who reached their late teens or early 20s were typically sold to less prestigious households, brothels, or labor operations, while those who suffered psychological breakdown or physical injuries were often abandoned or killed. Rather than receiving medical care or retirement support. The intergenerational impact of luxury. Teenage servitude created cycles of abuse within wealthy Roman households. As children who grew up witnessing the systematic exploitation of teenage servants learned to view adolescents as objects for their entertainment and gratification, perpetuating cultural patterns that normalized the abuse of vulnerable teenagers across multiple generations of Roman elite families. The long-term psychological damage inflicted on teenage slaves throughout the Roman Empire created intergenerational trauma that affected entire populations for centuries after the fall of Rome. While modern historians have systematically minimized or ignored the extent of teenage exploitation in ancient Rome to preserve comfortable narratives about classical civilization that avoid confronting the systematic torture and abuse of adolescence that was integral to Roman society. This historical revisionism has prevented modern societies from understanding how civilizations can normalize extreme abuse of teenagers while maintaining cultural legitimacy and intellectual respectability. The psychological symptoms documented in historical accounts of teenage slaves reveal trauma patterns that modern psychology recognizes as severe PTSD, dissociative disorders, and complex trauma responses that would have required extensive treatment and support to address. However, Roman society provided no psychological care or treatment for traumatized teenagers, viewing their mental health problems as character defects that required punishment rather than healing, creating additional layers of abuse for adolescents who were already suffering from systematic exploitation. The intergenerational transmission of trauma within slave families created cycles of psychological damage that persisted long after individual teenage victims had died or been freed, as parents who had survived teenage slavery often struggled with their own unresolved trauma while watching their children face similar exploitation. Historical accounts describe slave families where parents became severely depressed, anxious, or violent as they experienced the helplessness of being unable to protect their own teenagers from the same abuse they had endured. The cultural normalization of teenage abuse in Roman society created broader social patterns that extended far beyond the slave population. As Roman citizens who grew up witnessing or participating in the systematic exploitation of adolescents, slaves developed attitudes toward youth and vulnerability that influenced their treatment of all teenagers throughout the empire. This cultural acceptance of teenage abuse contributed to Roman social patterns that normalized violence against young people while treating adolescent suffering as entertainment rather than tragedy. The modern academic conspiracy to minimize or ignore Roman teenage slavery has created educational systems that teach false historical narratives about ancient Rome, while systematically excluding information about the systematic abuse of adolescence that was central to Roman economic and social systems. University history departments, textbook publishers, and cultural institutions have all participated in maintaining sanitized versions of Roman history that serve contemporary political and cultural agendas, while dishonoring the memory of hundreds of thousands of teenage victims. The institutional motivations for hiding Roman teenage abuse include religious, cultural, and nationalist ideologies that use classical antiquity to justify contemporary social structures, while avoiding examination of how ancient imperial systems actually operated. Academic historians who focus on Roman abuse of teenagers face professional marginalization and publication obstacles that effectively silence research challenging comfortable historical myths about classical civilization. The psychological impact on modern teenage abuse survivors who discover that historical teenage exploitation has been systematically hidden and minimized by academic institutions can create additional trauma and betrayal as survivors realize that the same institutional structures that failed to protect them have also failed to acknowledge or learn from historical patterns of systematic teenage victimization. This institutional betrayal compounds individual trauma while demonstrating that teenage protection continues to be treated as less important than adult comfort and institutional reputation. The international implications of sanitized Roman history include the export of false historical narratives that present classical antiquity as admirable and worthy of emulation, while completely ignoring the systematic abuse of teenagers that was integral to ancient imperial success. This cultural imperialism spreads dangerous historical myths that can be used to justify contemporary policies and social structures that harm teenagers, while claiming historical precedent and cultural legitimacy. The horrifying truth is that one of history's most celebrated civilizations systematically tortured, exploited, and murdered hundreds of thousands of teenagers, while historians have spent centuries hiding this reality to preserve comfortable myths about the glory of ancient Rome. Every time we praise Roman achievements without acknowledging the teenage slaves who suffered and died to make those accomplishments possible, we participate in a historical cover-up that dishonors victims and prevents us from learning crucial lessons about how societies normalize extreme abuse of young people. If discovering the hidden horror of teenage slavery in Rome has shattered your faith in sanitized history books, smash that like button, subscribe for more suppressed historical truths, and hit that notification bell, because the only way to protect today's teenagers is to remember what happened to those whose suffering has been deliberately forgotten.